Hello again, this is your video on Maxine Han Kingston's The Woman Warrior. This week I'm going to go ahead and do two videos. I'm going to introduce Kingston today and go over some major themes in this novel, and then about Wednesday of this week I'll put out another video that has to do with the second half of the novel and a little bit more of the resolutions about what's going on. I'll just come out and disclose up front, some of you that have taken classes from me before may have read this book. You may have read it in other places. This is one of my favorite books to teach. I love teaching it. I love Kingston's writing style. I love everything that this book has to offer. It broaches so many different subjects that are fun to talk about. So I try to incorporate it in whatever class, whatever subject matter I can, and it works in a lot of different avenues, from feminism to language acquisition to immigration patterns to culture shock to ethnic literature, stories of the postmodern, merging traditions and new ways of thinking. All of that is appropriate in looking at this book. So let me just first start by saying that this is a work of fiction based largely on Kingston's own personal life. So, and in fact, depending on what version of the book you have, it might have any number of different categories listed on there. The publishing companies brand the books often, and it may say biography, it may say autobiography, it may say fiction, it may say memoir. The subtitle that's included is Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts. So genre is only one particular way to begin talking about this book. But if we just understand that what Kingston is doing is largely based on her own experience, on her life, on her personal autobiographical story, we have sort of a large idea about what she is doing in the writing of this book. Now, if you're familiar with this book, we're going to come at this and we're going to be largely looking at the aspect of being an immigrant. And what we see is the story of Kingston's mother and Kingston's own version of herself in the book, in the fictionalized autobiography, existing across the transnational, transcultural divide, and it's represented by their separation over the immigration from China to the United States. And what we have here in terms of our class is the story of immigration disconnection. There's a huge divide placed between these two women, and others who are represented in the book as well, but these are the primary characters that we focus on, and we see them growing, side by side, trying to comprehend one world alongside their own, and looking back to different points through history that attempt to explain the different lives that they've led and how they might seek to align them a little bit. It starts out in the beginning with a first-person narration from the Kingston character, who begins telling you about her mother and about how her mother always would talk story to them. And this is a theme that comes up again and again, this idea of talk story. And there's a lesson, there's a message, there's a history, there's a culture, something in that story that's being passed on, right? And the first story we get is this story about her father's sister, who never existed because she shamed the family in some very specific way. And she goes on to tell her the history, the past of this woman, this no-name woman, who becomes a symbol of Chinese femininity. And Kingston's mother in the book, in the novel here, becomes the sort of broken stronghold of male enforced oppression. And she tells Kingston, don't tell your father that I'm telling you this story. And this idea sort of sets forth the ensuing discovery of her mother's past life in China and her own life in the present, which is the 1970s in San Francisco, and as they sort of relate to one another. And she keeps returning to her mother's character and her mother's time in China and her own time in the United States. And it's all sort of kicked off by this idea that I'm going to break the rules of not talking about the past and shame in our past family right off the bat. And, she reinforces them by saying, do not tell anybody what I'm about to tell you, but I'm going to tell you. So she opens the door and kicks off this wonderful memoir about being a woman and having to negotiate traditional Chinese culture while now living in the United States. Now, Kingston herself, I've put up an interview that you can watch and get to hear Kingston speak. This is from about 5 years ago. And she talks about her writing process, and she talks about her relationship with her mother, and she talks about the woman warrior in particular. But Kingston herself is a first-generation American in her family. She was born in California, like the character in this book, and her parents were first-generation Chinese immigrants. Kingston was born in 1940, and her parents had immigrated from China just in the 1930s. She was the third, though, of 8 children. There were 2 children, 2 ghosts, as she refers to them in this book, who did not come from China to the United States. They were left behind. Okay, so Kingston is the oldest of the 6 children born in the United States. So she grew up in the United States as the oldest and as the first of her parents' children who did not have actual physical relationship with their Chinese ancestry, homeland, tradition. And those 2 children, the children that I won't spoil for you, in the memoir we get a version of what happened to them. In real life it's a little different but sort of similar. Those 2 children represent a past that Kingston's parents had to separate from themselves in order to immigrate. And this is a symbol, this is a depiction of what it means to actually leave part of oneself behind and pick up something else and attempt to make something new while never quite detaching yourself all the way from a past. And that's the story of our immigration course, right? We're moving from Pfeiffer's, anecdotal, psychological effects that she's talking about in terms of displaced refugees, and now we're applying it to a specific pattern, a movement, if you will, of familial angst, right? The first-generation immigrant, like Pfeiffer was saying, of first-generation refugees and immigrants, are the ones who must do the struggle and must do the experience. And by the second generation, if you remember what she says, there is a need for success to happen. And if it doesn't happen, success, whatever we define it, if it doesn't happen in that second generation, it's likely that there are going to be further and further obstacles as more generations start coming. So what we see here is Kingston representing that rift, right? The last generation tied to China, the first generation born in America, and here she is spelling them out through the mother and the daughter. Okay? So back to Kingston's biography a little bit. She taught high school for a few years in California before she moved to Hawaii and began to write very feverishly. She felt the need to write autobiographically, and she began to craft the book that would become The Woman Warrior in Hawaii, and it was first published in 1976. She merges, as I've already sort of hinted at, fiction, tradition, nonfiction, autobiography, to help tell the story of immigrant experience of Chinese women, specifically across two countries and two cultures. But it's also, about the Chinese immigration experience in general, though it focuses very specifically on the women at times, and she's named it even the woman warrior. It does harbor greater nods towards the Chinese immigration experience. And she would go on to write, in fact, other books that would look specifically at the men, sort of invoking the women's experience that she's looking at here and extrapolating it a little bit. The first sections of the book, the parts that you'll read first, are going to be, a little bit of a jarring shift. This first chapter is a memory. It's the memory of this lost aunt and the secret that her mother is telling her. There's a bit of an informed sort of warning in saying that, this is why I'm telling you this, because you're now coming into womanhood. Don't shame the family. Your sexuality weakens you, all of these things. But there's also this implied message that this is a wrong that, we need to resurrect, and we need to bring this woman back into the fold. And by the end of that chapter, the woman's ghost, Kingston's narrator is writing, haunts her. She's being, sort of revisited by this ghost that her mother has drudged up, right? If you don't speak her name for years and years and you don't tell her story, she doesn't exist. And that portion of the family's history is negated until you tell her story. And once that story is passed into Kingston, who's the writer, of course, and the Kingston character here is also a writer, it becomes a part of that active immigration narrative, specifically looking at the women, and it agitates her. It stirs her up, and there's one point where she says that she doesn't believe she always wishes her well, because the writer, the Kingston character, is telling on her. She's evoking a past that had been covered. So then we go from here into a chapter that's entirely different. It's a fantasy sequence related to the Chinese mythological Fa Mulan, which most of us are probably familiar with through the Disney version. The very funny and very well done for Disney style Mulan characterization. And the myth itself is many hundreds of years old, and it's very similar to what you see in the Disney movie. And I will actually put up a link to a section of the old poem that goes with this. And it's very much the woman warrior idea, the woman taking the man's place because the man has no sons, and she steps up and passes herself off as man because she's been training and honing her skills in a way that only men had up to that point. And she uses this, Kingston does here, she uses this metaphor, this well-known mythology of Mulan, as a way to say that women, is certainly, it's implied even in the centuries-old poem, women can step into these male roles, but the warriorhood that they might seek out, while it might be literal, swords and battle and kung fu and all of this combat readiness that she's receiving, it also becomes in the ability to write and to tell the story and to craft the perspective and to carry the family's narrative forward. And there's a point in this particular chapter that I'm always pointing to whenever I teach this book, where after this character has been trained and she's been honed and taught and on this mountain where she was spirited away to, the names of her family's enemies are written into her back. And this writing, this putting into language, this telling becomes such an empowering act for her to go forward, right? And if you pair that with with Kingston's ending of the prior chapter, where she's the writer who is now going to tell the immigration story, including the shameful parts, the family parts that were left behind in China, and they're now being brought over to the United States by being remembered and told. You get this running theme that's established by the mother's element of talk story. It is a nugget of life and information that carries with it meaning and substance. Okay, and then in the next part, which is about the halfway point of the book, where we're finally sort of led into the quote-unquote present day period of the Kingston character in the 1970s, growing up in San Francisco, and we see the life that she's known, and we see, or we gather, because we know of this time in the United States, this is a very progressive time to be a woman in the United States, with many steps being taken forward to overcome systematic and de facto forms of oppression against women. And in San Francisco and California in particular, you've got a very liberal and progressive sort of cultural environment being stirred up. So Kingston herself and the character in this book grow up in a world that's very Americanized and westernized, and they must understand how this merges with their mother and father's version, their mother's in particular version of what Chinese tradition means to them. Okay, and so as we move into that part and then the later parts of the book, we see a resolution begin to fold. And largely, in terms of our course, the immigration aspect, this idea of being separated generationally by physical locality and traditions that happen thousands of miles across the ocean and aren't necessarily applicable here, we begin to understand that Brave Orchid, who is the mother character in this book, is fighting the feminist battle even prior to leaving China. And having her story now told is Kingston, the narrator's way of saying, well, let's pull that feminist agenda and that feminist approach, and since the mother has physically immigrated, let's see what that version of feminist belief and action looks like in the immigration process. Okay, does it translate? And I won't spoil it with too many details here about how this is represented, but you see the Kingston narrator telling this mother's story as a part of a respect, an elevation of the mother, and it certainly sort of gives a complexity to that mother figure in the first chapter who's saying, we've always not talked about your aunt. Let me tell you about her real quickly and reinforce why she's being shamed. Okay, there's a complexity to that, and this comes out more and more. And in the second half of the book, you'll see this sort of elaborated even more so. Okay, I'll leave you with that there, and I want you to watch the Kingston video. This is the first half of the book, and the reason I cut this video into two is because the second half deviates a little bit. It continues down this path of contemporary Chinese immigrants in America and their next generation, but it takes a little bit of a slight turn into looking more specifically at the way that Kingston perceives her world. As she sort of regresses a little bit to when she was a child and how she experienced school and how she experienced the culture shock going home, having a private world there, and then going out into the public world and having a different experience, and then moving as she does forward into this sort of later realized version of a storyteller, as this is how you take power away from all the unknown things, all the things that create a dissonance for the immigrant. And early on in the book, it's in one of these early 3 chapters, she says that naming all the different things, all the fearful things in the world, the things that cause dissidence and strife, naming them ghosts, like taxi ghosts and garbage men ghosts and all of these other different types of ghosts, is one way of sort of removing their power. And so it works on that trope of naming, telling the story, writing, controlling, which these Chinese immigrants and women in particular are working to gather their sort of warrior attack tools, artillery, armor. This is the types of warriors that Kingston is referring to. I'll sort of leave it right there for now. Go ahead and read through. We've got to read the entire book this week, so it might be a little tough to squeeze it all into one video here, so I thought I would do it on two. Look for the next one, maybe Wednesday. As I mentioned in the email earlier today, be careful if you're traveling. It sounds like the roads are going to get pretty bad, blizzard conditions. We will still, of course, have class, so it's a good thing. We don't have to necessarily worry about that. Watch for the next video. I'll, of course, send you an email when that one's ready. Let me know if you have any questions, and you have another reading response due this Friday, so be thinking about it in the same way that you thought about the Pfeiffer one. Ask yourself these types of questions. Focus in on some specific themes. Don't try to talk about everything, right? When I give you these video lectures, I'm highlighting a few things and trying to coalesce them into something that is relatable, related, and also relatable. Okay? Let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you again on probably Wednesday sometime with another video.